Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
This is Kinda Murdery Insomniac. Stories to stay awake by. Good evening, and welcome to Kinda Murdery Insomniac. Stories to stay awake by. I'm your host, Zevin Odelberg. Thank you for deciding to be here. I missed you last Thursday, Insomniacs, and I'm chomping at the bit to get right into the story. I'll give you till the count of 3 to jump off the train. 1, 2, 3. And assuming you're still with us, here we go. On January 31st, 1927, 41-year-old Miss Nellie Jones, who probably would have been referred to as a spinster in 1927, and an independent woman today, was found dressed all in black, lying on the bed, unconscious and partially asphyxiated. The oven door was open, and the dial was turned all the way to broil. Gas poured out of the oven with the quiet roar of a Lilliputian jet turbine. Which brings us to 2 pressing questions. Who was Nellie Jones? And why did she want to die? Those are important questions, but my sweet insomniacs, you should know me better than that by now. The questions will be answered in due time. But first, let me sketch the edges of this fever dream. Tonight, I bring you a tale discovered in the Oakland Tribune on Tuesday, February 1st, 1927. It is a tale of oracles, seers, that's right, fortune tellers, dark magic, and the occult. A story of confidence gained and confidence lost, of fortunes squandered to the love of Swamis, false doctors, and falser daddies. It is a heartbroken and felonious fable told to remind us that zebras, especially dishonest ones, can't, or won't, change their stripes, no matter how horrible the consequences of their chicanery. I tell you now of a woman named Miss Nellie Jones of Berkeley, California, once of Seattle, where she managed apartments, who at the dawn of her 40s was inexplicably rechristened Maggie by a plotting paramour who most certainly wanted more, or perhaps less, than her heart. And I give you another simple warning. If you're middle-aged and your older boyfriend insists on calling you by another name and signing all of his love letters, Daddy, assume he is manipulating you and run. Sadly, Miss Nellie Jones, called Maggie by the gross manipulator, believed in Daddy's words and writing until it was too late, and when his deception was revealed, broken-hearted and bankrupted, she tried, on the last day of January 1927, with the help of her oven, to transform her home into a deadly gas chamber. But the tragedy of Maggie's despair and self-harm is not where our story begins. Instead, it begins with Daddy. Oh, gross. Daddy was Dr. Victor Latour, a self-styled guru and master of the mystic arts, though hardly the heroic Dr. Stephen Strange master of the mystic arts. Indeed, Dr. Latour, and dear Legion, I hope you can hear the scathing air quotes I place around the word doctor as it relates to Victor Latour, who, though he may have shared mastery of the mystic arts with his Marvel counterpart Doctor Strange, was no avenger at all, but rather more of a Thanos, whose ignoble mission was, purely in the service of his own selfish ends, to snap his fingers and crumble the universes of hopeful women plied with love, whose trust he had nefariously gained. And if it sounds as though I'm short of breath, dear Legion, rest assured, it is rage that steals the air from my lungs. Yes, Dr. Victor Latour, predator of a trusting woman's hopes. That is the beast who begins tonight's story. A confidence man so brash that doctor was not illusion enough for him. No, indeed, in 1927, when he crushed the hopes of Nellie Jones, he had transcended mere feigned medical expertise and installed himself as something of an implied messiah, a guru, if you will, known as Swami Mahad. But our story doesn't begin with Swami Mahad in 1927. In fact, no. We commence 8 years earlier with the same man but a different Swami. In 1919, Dr. Latour was known not as Swami Mahad, but rather Swami Samata. I'd like to offer a quick moral suggestion, and I don't think I'm climbing too far up my high horse here. No, this is more of a moral Shetland pony. I say to you, if you find yourself not only assuming a Swami's alter ego, but also feeling it necessary to change that Swami's name, take a good hard look at yourself and your life choices, because chances are you're not a good person. And Victor Latour, a.k.a. Dr. Latour, a.k.a. Swami Mahad, a.k.a. Swami Samata, was most certainly not a good person. He was an inveterate liar, cheater, and con man with a long and surprisingly public career of brutal dishonesty towards women that publicly spanned almost 30 years, and likely started before and went on long after that. But tonight, we join Victor in action, not in Berkeley in the winter of 1927, when his callous conning convinced Nellie Jones to end her life, but rather we find him in warmer climes and younger years. There he is in Los Angeles, 8 years before Nellie despairs. It's 1919. He had different students, different lovers, different targets who innocently adored him, not knowing that they loved like lambs love a charming wolf. He's their teacher, not Dr. Victor Latour and not Swami Mahad. No, in Los Angeles in 1919, his acolytes know him as Swami Samata. And there, in L.A., sometime around the close of World War I confess it gives me great pleasure to say that the Swami found himself arrested. One of his students, a Miss Gladys Clint, was cannier than the rest, and a poorly chosen mark. She discovered that she had paid Swami $50, which is more like $800 today, Insomniacs, and received, in her words, nothing of value. And so, in return for that kindness, Gladys Clint, or should I say, my hero, called the police and had Swami Samata arrested. Sadly, for everyone involved in our stories, and particularly the rest of our story, Swami Samata's Southern Californian incarceration didn't stick. He simply returned Miss Clint's money and secured his release. If only things had gone so smoothly in Northern California for Miss Nellie Jones of Berkeley. Back to the Bay Area in 1927 now, where Swami Mahad, a.k.a. Dr. air quotes Victor Latour, was a psychologist, psychoanalyst, and a writer of books on the occult who kept offices in San Francisco. Nellie Jones was a 41-year-old, single, former apartment manager from Seattle who moved to 721 Hilldale Avenue in Berkeley in her late 30s and met Dr. Victor Latour, now known as the wise and powerful Swami Mahad. Full disclosure, the adjectives are mine and spoken with scorn. I suppose, Insomniacs, it's rather painfully obvious at this point that your humble host on this tour of mayhem and the macabre, your safari guide through Amazon rivers of metaphorical blood, namely me, finds Victor Latour distasteful in the extreme. To this insomniac, Conning a woman who loves and trusts you out of her money, her happiness, and her very desire to live is even more disgusting than murder. But I digress. Nellie Jones meets Victor Latour and swiftly finds herself in his thrall, taking his classes on fortune-telling, the occult and spiritualism, and horror of horrors shortly thereafter, falling deeply in love with him. Fortunately for Nellie Jones, by the time she met Victor Latour, she had amassed the tidy sum of $12,000, and when I say tidy, I do mean it. Adjust for inflation, and $12,000 in 1927 is nearly $200,000 today. The money would have to be considered fortunate. However, unfortunately for Nellie, she met Victor Latour, a.k.a. Swami Samada, a.k.a. Swami Mahad, and he was an inveterate piece of work. At 57 years old, Swami Mahad was a strong-jawed, handsome man with a Dracula pompadour and the mysterious arching eyebrows of a traveling circus magician. Nellie was dark-haired and attractive in a practical, thoughtful sort of way, with huge, luminous dark eyes that shone like lagoons at midnight. No aviator would ever paint her on the hull of a Spitfire, but it's easy to imagine a man falling for her. Tragically, that man was not Swami Mahad. He did love something, though. Something he considered his life's work. He loved taking money from trusting young women. And now we've covered something of the answer to our first question: who was Nellie Jones? The woman that Latour had rechristened Margaret and called Maggie in his love letters. This according to Nellie's best friend, a Miss Evans. And we approach approximate answer to our second question. Why did Nellie want to die? Love unrequited was certainly part of it. Latour had promised to leave his wife and marry Nellie, a promise he had no intention of keeping. Cads like him never do. The Swami, of course, denied his romance with Nellie entirely, although the many love letters in her possession, addressed to Nellie from Latour, speaking of love and signed, quote, Daddy, unquote, yuck, put the lie to Latour's denials. Speaking of letters, let's spend a moment with the letter that Nellie, expecting to die from natural gas asphyxiation, left for Latour. I hope, she wrote, that I have afforded you as much pleasure and amusement, as much as you have caused me of sadness and grief. Then indeed your cup is full and running over. You promised me all that was lovely and beautiful in life to share with me as I have you, and in confidence and in love you did this. Do you feel entirely happy over it, knowing that you never intended to live up to this, only until you had all that I could give you, and then you would move on to another? And here we touch upon the other reason for Nellie's grief, a reason that stings almost as sharp and deeply as a broken heart. Nothing twists the knife of betrayal quite like the lie of love used to relieve a victim of a large sum of money. As I mentioned earlier, Nellie had life savings of $12,000, nearly $200,000 today. Latour freely admits that he sold her his house for $5,250, and then that he borrowed $3,750 from her, a loan secured by a property he owned in Los Angeles, supposedly, and then that he borrowed another $300 from her sometime later. That's $9,300. Adjusted for inflation, he functionally stole $150,000 from Nellie, nearly all her net worth. She who loved him desperately, he promised to marry her. Then he took all of her money and dumped her, with no intention of repaying a penny. Suicide is never the answer. It's always better to live another day and try to find your way through the darkness. But Insomniacs, I think we can all understand why Nellie wanted to die. But thank God Nellie did not die that night. She was found unconscious by her friend Miss Evans, and she recovered from partial gas asphyxiation in the hospital. What became of Swami Mahad in regards to the story of Nellie Jones? I don't have an answer for you. But Dr. Victor Latour does appear again. In Los Angeles again. So perhaps he did have a home there after all, but I doubt it. He reappears in Los Angeles 16 years later in 1943, where occultism and fortune-telling have been made illegal by the city. And while awaiting trial after his most recent arrest for illegal fortune-telling, Victor Latour, who's plying his trade at a small booth in downtown LA, charging the cost of a $2 book for his clairvoyance services, appears in an article about fortune-telling and the occult written by a roving reporter who's taken the precaution of hiding her wedding ring when she visits Dr. Victor Latour. And what's the fortune he delivers her? Well, here it is. He says to the young, he thinks unmarried woman, "Your days of indolence are over," he tells her. "A strong man will fall in love with you soon enough." What a frickin' bum. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery Insomniac. Stories to stay awake by. Good night.
Kinda Murdery Insomniac is created, researched, edited, produced, and hosted by Zevin Odelberg, with opening theme by Niall Madden and art by the Gin of Lang. Available now on all podcasting platforms. If you like the show, please subscribe, review, and tell your friends. You can find us on social media at Kinda Murdery or email at kindamurdery@gmail.com.